Hi, I'm Richard Osborne, founder of Business Data Group and UK Business Forums, and I'm really pleased to be here today with Martin Swain, one of the executive directors from Companies House. Hello, Martin.
Hi, Richard. Nice to see you.
You too. Thank you for coming along here today. For those who might not be familiar with the full role of what Companies House does, would you like to just give us a run through really of what Companies House is today?
Yeah, sure. So in essence, Companies House is the UK register of companies. There's actually 3 registers. So there's a register for England and Wales, one for Scotland, one for Northern Ireland, and 3 registrars. So we're predominantly around the formation of companies, the repository for companies' information, and also their compliance with the Companies Act. However, we're also increasingly becoming more active around tackling economic crime, because unfortunately the UK register is used for illegal purposes.
Yeah. Which leads us quite nicely on to a conversation I had with Louise Smythe, who's the Registrar of Companies and CEO of Companies House. So for those of you who would have seen that last video, it just coincided with when the government published their response to the corporate transparency and register reform consultation, which a lot of people were pleased to see because that really focused on improving the integrity and the value of the data at Companies House at that time. And Companies House published a 2020 to 25 business plan, for want of a better word. So as a sort of overview, really, what does that sort of 5-year plan encompass going forward? What we're looking to achieve?
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, it's probably worth reiterating the kind of scale, I guess, of reform. It's actually going to be the biggest change to Companies House since we were formed in 1844. So it's a significant rewrite of the legislation. And our strategy really was our ambition to sit alongside reform, and we eagerly await the legislation, but the transformation really of Companies House sits alongside it, and the strategy really is about the transformation. So it's improving our contribution that we make to tackling economic crime. It's improving the quality of the data, improving our customer service, which is generally really good, but we'd like to improve it further. And really it's setting out the scale of what we want to achieve. We've got some quite old systems, legacy systems in Companies House. We're in the middle of transforming many of those. So it's about really developing really good systems to support really good services. I'm sure Louise spoke at the time as well about the value of our people. And that's the other element of our strategy. We've got a major transformation around our people. A lot of the skills that we're going to need in the future, we don't have at the moment. So anybody involved in running an organization will say that people transformation is a significant challenge. But we're kind of on that journey. We're just around about the middle of our strategic plan period. So we're actually just kind of taking stock at the moment as well, where we've got to so far and what we may need to do in the next 2.5 years to 2025.
Yeah, and that's one of the big changes that you touched on there is relating to economic crime, which we can sort of get into detail throughout this conversation. But looking at what Companies House and the legislation around what Companies House can and cannot do at the moment lends to, I mean, I'll be open and say sometimes some unfair criticism I feel of Companies House. But as you say, it's a transformation that's, the biggest since 1843, I think you said there. So today, the way the rules are, if somebody sends some information through, whether it's the setting up of a company, adding of a director, what options do you have as an organisation, as a register?
Yeah, so it is really challenging, Richard. So the Companies Act is formed on the basis of what's called proper delivery. Yeah. So technically, if somebody submits the information in the right form, with the right fee, with the right information in it, we are legally bound to register that information. It doesn't stop us from an integrity perspective. Obviously, questioning something where we clearly know it to be untrue or potentially fraudulent. But the law is fairly strict in terms of what the registrar has to do, and I think this is where the frustration with Companies House and the criticism comes from, is that quite often we are seen to effectively say, we can't do anything about it, and that's even where people have had their address used without their permission. They've been appointed as a director when they're not a director, and it can be extremely frustrating because these people aren't even customers of Companies House. They are people who have been affected by somebody using their details for illicit purposes. So that's why the law needs to be changed. We do as much as we can within the limits of our powers. We obviously have to take care in that, because the registrar could be judicially reviewed if she acted outside her powers. But there are things that we can do, and from a tackling criminality perspective, we do work very, very closely with law enforcement agencies, both local law enforcement and national law enforcement. And there's ways that we can work with those agencies by using their powers as opposed to ours. So, we do quite a bit of work with the National Crime Agency, supporting investigations at that national level. But I think it's fair to say the way the Companies Act was constructed in 2006 was a time when it was, the focus was breaking red tape for businesses, making it easy for people to form a company, to operate a company. And in doing so, unfortunately, the law has a number of loopholes, which unfortunately an increasing number of people are identifying and using, to defraud people and to engage in criminality.
So 15, 16 years on from that time, and the world has become smaller, fraud has become more complex. If people, they'll find they'll find loopholes.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's in a digital world, it's even easier. And you're talking about fraud from a small scale individual defrauding somebody of their life savings up to, multi-billion pound money laundering and complex fraud systems with very, very complex structures underneath it to enable that. So it's an ever increasing problem, and I think the government recognises that. And certainly in the last few weeks, there's been a lot of coverage around economic crime and the need to do more to tackle it.
Yeah, and that's round about sort of this time during the 2025 vision that was published by Companies House. There was one of the key areas was looking at the identification, verification of people who are within a business themselves. And I know shareholder positions weren't included within that because if you think my take on it anyway, is if you think of large PSCs or large organisations with a number of shareholders, it becomes unmanageable. But if we're looking at PSCs or persons of significant control and directors, that was sort of one of the key areas and the key focus. So I've seen that sort of proof of concept work's been done on that. So how is that coming together?
Yeah, so we've been doing quite a bit of work around the identity verification. It's quite challenging because we don't have a legal power at the moment, and for anybody familiar with government funding and finance, you can't actually spend public money unless you've got a primary legislative basis to do it. But we have been doing lots of work talking to ID providers, talking to our in-house development teams and to other organisations around and government digital service, for example, around how we would operate an ID verification system. I think it's going to be a challenge because it's something we've never done before. It's a central plank of reform. And it's probably the biggest area where people are probably surprised at the fact that we don't verify people's identity when they form a company or when they're appointed as a director or a PSC. So it's a really important part of the transformation. It's a really important part of reform. We're also developing other systems to create the ability for people to have an account with us, and we'll need to link that closely to ID verification. We've also been talking to other registries around the world that do ID verification, and looking at the models that they operate. Most tend to operate on the basis of working with external providers to do the verification and then bringing that in. So anybody familiar with verifying with government at the moment, invariably you go into the system, it takes you out to a range of providers, you choose which provider you want, and then you verified, and then you come back in. So, and we've been doing some work with other agencies already, like HMRC, where we've built the ability for our system and their system to work alongside each other. So if you form a company with us, you can register for corporation tax at exactly the same time. As a customer, you don't know that you're doing that, and you'll flip in between us and HMRC. It's a single system. So we'll probably be looking at that kind of operation for ID verification. But it's a big project for us. As I say, it's a central part of reform. And I think it's probably, in terms of the integrity of the register, probably one of the most important parts.
So we, as Business Data Group, we provide software to the company formations industry. So we've had to look at various ways of addressing ID verification. And I know I've spoken to some of your colleagues about this. So I'm aware and think what sort of work that's been done is great. What's the current sort of thought processes around, or current thinking towards the scope of what cannot be ID verified, if we've reached that sort of stage? So thinking of like overseas individuals or those that cannot be verified electronically, that covers probably 30-40%. Is that something that's on the radar, or something that's...
Yeah, they're two really key issues for us. I think the accessibility issue is one. So we're going to have to, as much as we want to be a completely digital organisation, I think we talk about being completely digitally enabled. We'll always understand that some people won't be able to transact with us digitally. So we'll have to, we will have to have non-digital ways for people to verify. We're currently doing some scoping work around the types of information that we would want to have in terms of confirming ID. Overseas is a challenge, because obviously there are different forms of ID overseas. Many other countries have ID cards, for example, so that makes it easy. But if you're in a country which doesn't have a robust system of ID verification, we will have challenges there. I think some of the proposals that the government are coming out with now around re-domiciling companies and potentially opening a scheme for that raises some challenges around what we would take. I think we kind of look at overseas in terms of looking at whether their systems of verification would be comparable with what we would want. So we'd look at we've been doing some work with the industry around the standards that exist. So we'd be looking for comparable standards. But it is a challenge. But if I flip to my kind of tackling economic crime side of things, I think that will actually flush out a lot of people who are using the register for illicit purposes. Yeah. We're not naive. People will get around it. Probably the very organised criminals are already figuring out how they would get around our ID checks, which is the same for anybody involved in tackling crime.
Yeah. They will. It's the way they work for it. But I think the key objective is to increase the barrier to entry, to make it more challenging, and then hopefully, I shouldn't say hopefully, wrong word really, but potentially other jurisdictions may suddenly appear more easier targets for that kind of use. One of the things that you mentioned during the conversation with the Treasury Committee and the Economic Crime Bill sort of being reviewed there was that Companies House was looking at potentially increasing the scope of filing of accounts and sort of financial information for companies beyond what was originally in the consultation. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so you'll be aware that after the main consultation, the government consulted on 3 further aspects. One was accounts, so some fairly detailed proposals. I think from our perspective, we'd want to simplify the accounts that are filed. I think there's a view that there are too many different forms of accounts. There's also some commentary from some areas that the accounts that are filed don't contain the information that's relevant, or that it's enough information for people to form a view on the company. So we would look to tighten that up. There will be a further kind of publication from government, we expect fairly soon, in terms of their response to those further consultations. So we'll be able to talk a bit more then about what we're proposing in this area. One of the things we're looking at is that we want ideally, as many companies as possible, going back to that accessibility point, but to file digitally with us. It's easier for customers to do that, but also from our perspective, it gives us a much richer data set to work from. People file paper accounts. It's near on impossible. Yeah, if we've got 40% of the register that's filed on paper, that's 40% of the data that we're not using to analyse. People aren't using it. They can't access it in the way they have to search, they have to download. So the more we can move people to file digitally, the richer the data becomes and the integrity is improved.
Is there scope to potentially legislate for electronic filing of accounts data?
I think the proposal is potentially to give us a power around mandation, but not to include that specifically. With my communications hat on, I always tend to favour encouraging customer behaviour to change rather than mandating. I don't think that necessarily drives the right behaviour. And we've seen actually in some of our other work that we've done, we can improve compliance by that kind of nudge behaviour, nudge theory. So we are doing quite a bit of that as well.
What about cross-reference or sharing financial data with HMRC, Companies House, or file once effectively?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of conversations going on within government, within Whitehall, various departments about the kind of file once concept. It's been on the kind of discussion table for quite a while. We do already do a fair amount of work with HMRC, and we're continuing to do work with them. Interestingly, we did a piece of work with them around accounts, and what we found was companies were filing different accounts with Companies House and with HMRC. So there's clearly a lot of work to do there. But we're also trying to do some more work with people like the FRC, Financial Reporting Council, because I think there's a benefit to us being able to have the same data coming into us as to them. But yeah, that's an area where I think the government needs to probably give some more thought to.
Yeah, that's cool. So one of the things that before meeting today is I asked on UK Business Forums if any sort of business owners had any questions they'd like to ask or put to Companies House, things that they've come across themselves. So what I'd like to do is sort of run through some of these and see. Now, the first one on the list, I think we may have already touched on already as the sort of forthcoming solution, but they've experienced situations where one person is showing 2, 3, 4 or more times on Companies House, often with either a slightly misspelt name or a misspelt address. Twofold really is, how does that get resolved if it's seen to happen? And then secondly, sort of what sort of plans are in place to overcome that sort of situation happening again?
Yeah, so I'd say the first thing, I guess, is this is probably one of the loopholes that we've talked about. So I can register a company. I can register it with my name, Martin Swain, spelt with an I. I can register another company spelt with a Y. I can register another one spelt with an E on the end of my surname. And I'm the same person doing all of that. At the moment, that's not illegal. We don't verify ID, so I don't know whether it's that person. In the future, obviously, verification will solve this, because we would require ID verification to prove that you're the person. Unfortunately, this is where the fraudulent people exploit the company's register, and they do exactly this type of thing, where they just make a slight change to the name. It doesn't go unnoticed. We do have an integrity team, we do have an intelligence team. We do track these people within the confines of our powers. We will talk to law enforcement agencies, we will talk to the police. So if we do see this kind of behaviour where it's being used for illegal purposes, we will take action. I think a lot of press reports tend to paint Companies House as a very passive organisation. We obviously can't talk openly about our tactics in terms of trying to tackle criminality, but we do a lot behind the scenes where we see this kind of thing.
Yeah. And perhaps $1 million question that you may not... Before asking this question, I know it depends on legislation, but at a very high level, how soon would Companies House hope to implement verifying people's ID?
It is subject to legislation. As I said earlier, we'd have to have legislation. But if we were to get legislation in the next 12 to 18 months, then I would imagine probably a year after that we would be up and running and be verifying ID. And
the sort of drifting, before I go on to the next question, associated with that, obviously there's a huge database of people within Companies House. Is the process to address that going forward through a means of annual filings? So like utilising existing confirmation process to verify people's ID. Is that the current thinking?
I think the current thinking is that we would require everybody on the register to verify their ID within a set period of time. Right. We're talking to the department at the moment about what that period of time would be. But the principle would be, if you are an existing director or a PSC, you would have to verify within a period of time. And then obviously anybody newly appointed or creating a company would be verified as they come on the register. Somebody else
wanted to understand, I've got an add-on question to this actually, but if they have some incorrect information on their company, they weren't very specific about what it was. So we're going to work on the basis it may have been shareholding information, or it might be directors' details. What's the process for getting that corrected?
There's two, so it depends. If somebody's made an error themselves, then clearly they can rectify that by talking to us, and we will seek to rectify it. It isn't as straightforward as taking the information off and putting new information on. I had a very interesting conversation with a very, very large company last year their accountants actually filed their accounts incorrectly. And they just couldn't understand that. Why couldn't we just take those set of accounts off the register and put the new ones on? We're not able to do that because it's a matter of fact on the register. So if somebody makes an error, files something incorrectly, then they can get in touch with us and we will work with them to rectify that. It's slightly more difficult if somebody else puts that information on. So I think you mentioned earlier about somebody being appointed as a director who's not a director. And we see this quite a lot. I deal with quite a lot of correspondence from people who are very unhappy that they've been appointed as a director, and the first they find out is that a letter arrives from Companies House saying, "Congratulations, you're a director, these are your responsibilities." Unfortunately, we can't just remove that, and they have to go through a process. It takes 28 days. We have to write, unbelievably, we have to write to the company to say, you need to provide evidence that this person is a director. Often that's writing to the person at their home address. So when I talk about the vagaries of the Companies Act, trying to explain this to somebody, you've been appointed as a director, you're not a director.
I can imagine that could be quite distressing, actually, thinking about it, because they might have the home address on the public record as a service address. And
more often than not, they've had their address used as well. So they've had their address used, they've been appointed as a director, they don't know anything about it. It was in the Sunday newspapers, address in Weston-super-Mare, flat above a shop, 2,000 companies registered to it, they didn't know anything about it. And it isn't as straightforward as just saying, okay, fine, if you can give us evidence that's the case, we'll just take them off. We can't do that. And it's a horrible situation, having to speak to somebody and say, you have to fill out a form, you have to send it to us. We've got a right to the company to give them a chance to provide evidence. And I actually had a case this month where an individual had not only stolen somebody's address and made them a director, but when we actually wrote to the registered office, which wasn't their kind of home address, the fraudster actually sent in fraudulent evidence. So not only were they, able to kind of use the address and name, and we had to actually say to the person, because we've had evidence now, we have to stop your objection. So reform can't come soon enough, really, because in a reformed world, we'd have powers to prevent that getting onto the register. We'd have powers of removal. So, if you're an innocent individual who's had their identity stolen, we can at least move very quickly to solve that. But it's a real issue for us.
And to what extent are the reforms tied to the economic crime bill that's been delayed at the moment?
So it's linked really closely. I think, if you're familiar with the economic crime plan, the government's economic crime plan, there's clear actions in there around reforming Companies House and creating a new register of overseas ownership of property in the UK. So they're really closely linked. We are working very closely with BEIS and with the Home Office around the legislative proposals. We've had a fair amount of input into how that legislation is taking shape. I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of coverage in the last few weeks at a very high level around the importance of the legislation. We're hopeful that it's going to be in the Queen's speech, but obviously we don't know until that time, because we're really keen to get on with implementing the legislation and delivering our transformation. So, we eagerly await it.
So, related to that, potentially, because I can speak firsthand. I know that everybody at Companies House is really keen for this to go through, and I'm also aware that so many people within BEIS as well. Everybody's keen for it to happen. But it's a government decision ultimately. So would it be fair to say that anybody who watches this over the next couple of weeks and is keen for this to go through, a right course of action might be to sort of garner some support from their MP, to try and see if they can push, sort of raise, to keep the profile there, to keep this moving?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, this has huge support from pretty much all quarters. I mean, if you watch the kind of coverage in the last few weeks, it's got kind of cross-party support in Parliament. I speak to many MPs frequently. They are very, very keen for this legislation to happen. I guess from our perspective as an agency, any support that organisations can give to this agenda would be great for us. But I think my general view is it's a matter of getting parliamentary time rather than this not happening. And I think, the general feeling, certainly from my reading of the events in the last few weeks, is that, this will not have much resistance in a sense, and there's a lot of support for it.
You've answered one of the other questions, actually, as we spoke about that, because one of the questions that came up, a few people, was about people being added or removed from a company without their knowledge or consent. So we've covered that part. The one thing slightly not legislatively related, But this comes from more sort of an accountants and sort of professional advisors base. This is about maintenance windows and when maintenance is carried out and the system's carried. So I'm just relaying this on really, is around about end of month maintenance windows and a request, can they be moved to starter months? Is there something that controls that, or?
It's not a part of the business that I'm wholly familiar with, but I can certainly talk to the director of digital about that. I mean, obviously, like any big organisation, we've got to shut down our systems now and again to carry out maintenance and to carry out upgrades. I know that for Louise, the registrar, it's one of the most stressful times because if the systems don't come back up, then it can have very, very significant impacts. I know there's a lot of communication that happens with customers around when we are going to do it, but I'll certainly take that back to talk to colleagues about that.
And I think it would be thinking about the time of the year, and as we're talking here, there's been a lot of media attention, particularly around abuse of the COVID support schemes that have been provided to business, and so many businesses have so desperately needed, but sadly also exploited in situations, whether it is new companies, whether it's shelf companies, which for those who may not be familiar is there's an industry around people who will register a limited company with nominees and have it sat there for a year or two to age and then sell that at a profit later on. And that's been abused throughout the pandemic to get bounce back loans. How closely has HMRC and Companies House been working together in sort of supporting the insolvency service as well, and really sort of addressing this and sort of combating and dealing with this sort of fraud?
Yeah, so we've been working really closely with Cabinet Office actually and HMRC because obviously we recognise, there was a significant growth in incorporations during the pandemic. Some of those are completely legitimate. They are people choosing to set up a company for whatever reason, either they've left their employment or whatever. But we do know that a significant number of companies have been used to exploit government schemes. As I say, we are working very, very closely with the Lead Department, Cabinet Office and other agencies to identify where that's happening. We've also seen other forms of fraud. So, for example, we've seen shell companies being created, and again, people not familiar with that, that's umbrella companies. This is where a vast number of smaller companies are set up with one controlling company above it, and essentially it's to exploit national insurance exemptions. And we actually saw a scheme that had been set up by people in the Philippines where there was hundreds of companies involved, millions of pounds worth of national insurance fraud. So again, we've worked very closely with HMRC on that. And that's the kind of intelligence activity which perhaps goes unseen because we don't talk about it. Naturally, we're not going to give our tactics away in terms of the intelligence gathering that we do and sharing. And we have been involved in some big investigations in the last couple of years.
Yeah. That's and I suppose really lastly, you touched on it earlier about the other 3 consultations that are going through. Well, they've been through. Sorry, we're just waiting for the government's response. So, one relating to the powers of the registrar to query and remove. That's quite paramount to part of the reforms and sort of stopping stuff finding its way to the register that shouldn't be there. The quality of financial information, so we sort of covered that earlier as well, and then sort of the ban on corporate directors. That last one, in my sheltered life, I struggle to see a purpose for corporate directors. But is there a reason for corporate directors? Just sort of a reason why they should remain?
I mean, my instinct says that it's not transparent. Because you're not getting to that natural person at the end. I guess when you're starting to look at fairly big, complex corporate structures, then potentially you could see an argument that, if you've got a company which has got 12 directors, which is a director of another company and another company, and it's legitimate, it's just a complex group structure, do you then get to the point of it being relevant? Again, I guess the issue for me, though, is from a transparency perspective, you're not getting to the people who are owning and running the company, which is a central plank of reform. And also from an intelligence and enforcement perspective, one of the challenges we have is you can't take prosecution action against a company. You can only take prosecution action against an individual. No. So if it's a corporate director that's...
You also have the situation, we have those sort of the triangle three, can't we? Director or a director or a director, which people have exploited.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see what the government's position is on that one.
No, that's brilliant. Well, I'd like to bring that to an end. Thank you very much, Martin. Really interesting conversation. Thank you again. And to anybody else, there are changes coming. I'm looking forward to seeing how all this comes together over the next couple of years. And as Companies House reforms, we'll have other conversations with Martin or his colleagues over the next couple of years to follow the progress and follow that transition period. Thank you.